Arguably, no two people did more to advance the early field of paleontology than Edwin Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. Between 1864 and Cope's death in 1897, the two men were locked in a race to discover and catalog as many new species of dinosaur as they possibly could. Unfortunately, their bitter rivalry resulted in so many underhanded dealings and straight-up felonies that their reputations were forever destroyed, and fossil hunting carried a dark stain for decades afterward. Today, we're talking about the strange feud that created and almost destroyed paleontology. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel below. Now grab your pith helmet and let's get going. The feud between Cope and Marsh was so intense that the bickering scientists would routinely dynamite their own dig sites to prevent the other from potentially combing back over the excavation and discovering something. That's a level of pettiness so casually destructive, it's almost admirable. There's no telling how many species of dinosaur have gone undiscovered thanks to Cope and Marsh's literally explosive rivalry. During the early days of the feud, Cope incorrectly reconstructed an Elasmosaurus skeleton, placing the animal's skull at the tip of its tail and believing he had discovered a new species of snake-like dinosaur. Unable to resist the opportunity to deliver a backboard-shattering dunk on his rival, Marsh called out Cope's mistake in a letter to the New York Herald, claiming that he had pointed the error out to Cope and that Cope's wounded vanity had never recovered from the crippling blow. In reality, Cope's mentor, Joseph Leidy, had actually discovered the mistake, and Cope had desperately attempted to buy up and destroy every scientific journal that had printed his error in a stunning display of the 19th century equivalent of the "someone hacked my Twitter" defense. By the time everything was said and done, the Bone Wars did a tremendous amount of long-term good for the field of paleontology. However, at the time, Marsh and Cope were so eager to beat each other in making new discoveries that their work was sloppy and filled with more errors than a Little League baseball game. By the time the excavation dust settled, Marsh and Cope claimed to have identified 142 unique species of dinosaur. Today, less than 40 of their discoveries are considered valid. In fact, Cope is responsible for the whole Brontosaurus-Apatosaurus debate when he mistakenly identified an Apatosaurus specimen as a new species. Ironically, through no fault of his own, Cope's Brontosaurus snafu was validated in 2015 when researchers determined that there were enough significant differences in Cope's specimen to classify it as a new species. When they weren't trolling each other in scientific journals and blowing up their own dig sites, Cope and Marsh conducted a great deal of their feud at a distance, sending hired agents across the country to do their dirty work. The agents, which included the two paleontologists' respective students, would scour dig sites in secret and try to scoop up valuable fossils. Marsh had more money to burn than Cope and would also resort to flat-out bribery to get the best bones, although Cope was not above skullduggery. You know, like using dynamite. In a turn of events that might not exactly come as a surprise, Cope and Marsh eventually hired dinosaur rustlers, which is a charmingly paleontological term for armed thugs to steal fossils. Cope kicked things off by paying a prospector to steal bones from Marsh's dig in Como Bluff, Wyoming, and after that, the thieving genie was out of the bottle. The dinosaur rustlers would spy on rival dig sites, poach fossils, and even throw rocks at excavating workers. Eventually, one of the rustler clashes nearly broke out in a full-blown gunfight, but tempers cooled and the Bone Wars carried on without any actual shots being fired. Cope's mentor, Joseph Leidy, actually discovered the first dinosaur in America, the Hadrosaurus, in Haydenfield, New Jersey in 1856. A decade later, Cope joined the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences and set up a fossil hunting operation in Haydenfield. Marsh caught wind of this and bribed some of the workers to send any fossils he discovered to him rather than Cope, presumably while twirling his considerable facial hair. An understandably enraged Cope found out what Marsh was doing, and part 2 of the Bone Wars had begun. Astonishingly, Cope and Marsh weren't always at each other's throats. The two men initially met in Berlin in 1864 when studying abroad and were impressed enough that they actually named dinosaur species after each other. Obviously, Cope and Marsh's brief professional camaraderie didn't translate into a lasting friendship. Either that, or they thought bribery, theft, and destruction of priceless artifacts were things good buddies do. Towards the end of the Bone Wars, Cope was pretty beaten down. He was broke and divorced with nothing more to show for his bitter feud with Marsh than a tarnished reputation and a collection of fossils, and Marsh did his best to take those too. In the 1880s, Marsh became the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he pushed through a law stating that any fossils collected using any kind of government funding automatically belonged to the Smithsonian Museum. His goal was to take Cope's fossils, but Cope was an obsessive record keeper, and he had the receipts to prove that he had indeed blown his own cash to acquire the majority of his specimens. Proof of his fossil ownership weren't the only receipts Cope brought. After nearly having a specimen seized by the Smithsonian thanks to Marsh's chicanery, Cope published a damning record of the many slimy misdeeds and outright felonies Marsh had committed during the Bone Wars, corroborated by many of Marsh's former employees. Marsh was forced to resign from his position as the head of the Geological Survey, and as an added ironic twist of the knife, he was unable to prove ownership of most of his vast fossil collection. So, in accordance with the law he'd championed in an attempt to screw over Cope, the majority of Marsh's fossils were seized by the Smithsonian. Cue sad trombone. Had Twitter existed in the late 19th century, Marsh and Cope would be adding and subtweeting each other every minute of the day. Instead, they had to make do with ridiculing each other in the scientific journals of the day, constantly pointing out the other's errors and inaccuracies while trumping up their own theories in the pages of these academic publications. They would even attempt to rename dinosaur species that the other had discovered. In a particularly outrageous example, Marsh, Cope, and Joseph Leidy engaged in a protracted argument over the name of a species all three men had independently discovered, like the episode of The Simpsons where Bart, Milhouse, and Martin can't decide who gets to keep the Radioactive Man comic. The expansion of railroads opened up the American West, and Marsh and Cope wasted no time racing each other to the Pacific coast to discover more fossils. It would turn out to be one of the most lucrative decisions of their respective careers. New excavation sites in states like Wyoming and Colorado yielded some of the most famous finds in paleontological history, including the discoveries of Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and Allosaurus. But the enthusiasm with which the two men attacked their rivalry continued to do almost as much harm to the field as good. You already know that Marsh firmly believed in putting his money in the right palms to give him the edge over Cope. The problem was, everyone else knew it too. When some railroad workers unearthed an impressive cache of fossils in the 1870s, they contacted Marsh, but hinted that they were also talking to Cope, even though they weren't, knowing that Marsh's need to outbid his rival would allow them to ask for some truly ridiculous prices. Marsh would have fallen hard for that Nigerian princess scam if dinosaur bones were on the table. Although Marsh eventually became the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, Cope scored an early victory by getting a position with the organization to survey new territory out west. He used this position to document and claim credit for as many species as he possibly could, which angered pretty much all of his peers, including his mentor, Joseph Leidy. Marsh responded to Cope's glory-hogging in typical Marsh fashion. He hired a bunch of goons to infiltrate Cope's expeditions and steal fossils. You really have to admire his consistency. Marsh was born poor, but he had a wealthy uncle in George Peabody, who founded the Museum of Natural Science at Yale University. In a shocking coincidence, Marsh received his first academic position at the museum not long after it was founded. Marsh's uncle funded many of his studies and provided him with the valuable connections that would eventually make him the head of the Geological Survey. Uncle Peabody's patronage helped Marsh keep up with Cope, who was born into wealth and had a sizable inheritance, which would quickly evaporate once he met Marsh. Despite Cope's victory in effectively getting Marsh fired from the Geological Survey and having most of his specimens seized by the Smithsonian, Marsh actually discovered more dinosaur species, and both men died poor and with academic reputations that could gently be described as less than favorable. They were ultimately both casualties of the Bone Wars rather than victors. The real winner was Joseph Leidy. He eventually got sick of the conflict between Marsh and his former protege Cope and left dinosaur hunting altogether to study other prehistoric species, ultimately discovering more than 400 species of protozoans and invertebrates. The Smithsonian also made out pretty good. Thanks to the rivalry and Marsh's self-defeating law, the Smithsonian wound up with an impressive collection of dinosaur bones. Cope died in 1897, but he tried one last time to score a spectacular dunk on his hated rival. In his will, Cope stipulated that his brain was to be removed from his body and weighed, and challenged Marsh to do the same upon his death to see whose brain was the heaviest. Cope hoped that his own pettiness would be matched by Marsh. But Marsh, showing restraint for perhaps the first time in his life, declined to accept the challenge and took the secret of his brain weight to the grave in 1899. The rivalry between Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh pushed the field of paleontology forward more than any other period in history, but their reckless and decidedly unscientific behavior gave dinosaur hunting an unsavory reputation